Hello, my name is Dante Renee, and welcome to the 10 Room Bizarro YouTube page where I talk about films that I believe need to be talked about more. Like tonight's film, 1987's Super Sex. This is 1987 Super Sex. Look at that poster art right there. And this is part of the Peakorama Big 2-unit show from Vinegar Syndrome with Pulsating Flesh, which I've already reviewed on this YouTube page. This is Super Sex, also directed by Carlos Tobalina. Both of these films are by Carlos Tobalina, who goes by Troy Benny in the credits, but the interesting thing is that he uses his real name as a writing co-credit in the opening title sequence of the film. Super Sex is from 1987, and it is 80 minutes long. I picked up this Peakorama Big 2-unit show for about 15, 16 bucks, something like that. If you look at the back here, we got two screenshots. I'm going to try to show you two screenshots from Super Sex right here. So let's get into this film here, 1987 by Carlos Tobalina. I've reviewed a lot of Carlos Tobalina films on this YouTube page already. Here is another one from 1987, Super Sex. And there's the poster once again, right there, folks. Super Sex details the the mix of psychology and sexuality and how those two connect. Now, if you know Carlos Tobalina at all, you know that Carlos, in a variety of his films, will kind of use themes of the sociology and the psychology of sexuality. He will do that in almost a way that it's seemingly educational or seemingly poignant in its themes in a way that is really saying something in its freedom, in its free love, in its lack of sexual boundaries, and kind of answering life's questions of using sexuality, answering life's questions in ways that normal society does not. And so Carlos Tobalina will answer those questions in a way of using the foundation of free love, using the foundation of lack of boundaries in life, and kind of going against the grain of normal society's belief systems and worldviews and definitions. I mean, the mere act of X-rated cinema in and of itself is against the grain, against the boundaries of cinema and even of life itself, in many regards. I mean, these people, especially, in the 80s and the 70s, 60s. I mean, this was dangerous to be in these films. I mean, you could be, there could be some kind of criminal activity involved. I mean, this was, maybe not so much in 87 per se, but I mean, we were definitely having issues with the vice squads and police. And so, I mean, this was dangerous cinema. This was dangerous stuff. This was not, I mean, if you were in these films, if you were making these films, and so the mere act of X-rated cinema in and of itself really flows well with Carlos Tobalina's themes. And in this film, we have a psychologist office, I guess it's a psychologist, psychiatry, a counseling office, that we have a counselor, we have his secretary, and they're going away on vacation, and he gets a replacement of another psychiatrist, counselor, and another secretary. And when those replacements come in is when they truly shift the methods and the focus of the office itself. Now, the interesting thing is that the movie plays with fantasies and dreams, and it also plays with hypnosis, and it also plays with actual sexuality curing psychological issues. So let's look at Super Sex from 1987. First and foremost, the music. If you know Carlos Tobalina's films, you're going to know there is wall-to-wall music, and that's no exception in this film. There's wall-to-wall music in this film. Now, the interesting thing is that the music really starts off for a while into the 80-minute film. For a while, it is very dreamy, very slow, and almost psychedelic at times, and the hints of jazz, the hints of funk, and almost jazzy, funky, groovy elevator music of sorts that you could almost. I'm trying to figure out these ways to describe it. And then all of a sudden, electronics go crazy, and the beat gets fast and it explodes audibly into your eardrums, and all of a sudden the music starts to redefine what you're watching on the screen, and even though what has been happening on the screen seemingly has been at the same pace, when the music kicks up into this almost disco groovy funky tinges of 80s electronica mixed in there, you start to redefine the actual pacing of the film that you're watching, of the sex scene that you're watching. Now, this film is wall to wall. We have tons of sex in this film, if you know Carlos Tobalina's films, and so we have tons of music. Um, and the music, once it picks up in that section of the film, all of a sudden, from slow to fast, um, then we start to mix back and forth throughout the film between slower music and that fast music, and it almost sounds like a radio station of sorts, where we are moving from song to song to song to song. In a typical film, sometimes you would hear a song end and you would think that the scene is ending. Not so in Carlos Tobalina's films, where the song ends, it doesn't mean the scene is going to end. So do not fret, the sex scene is not ending. Another song will begin, and then we have the continuation of the sex scene or the scene itself. So tons and tons of music, and we have just an emphasis on groovy, funky, a bit of disco, a bit of dance music, a bit of electronica. And the interesting thing is that in comparison with other Carlos Tobalina films from the 80s, and this is actually, late 80s, 87, it wasn't like a glaring, obvious, this is 80s music. It didn't have that to me as much in this one. There were definitely hints of it, but I was getting mixing of 80s and 70s music in here in some exciting scenarios. Stylistically, we have close-ups, and we also have lots of different angles and some distant shots of the sex scenes itself. We have what seems to be once again the Carlos Tobalina, the outside of his house, I believe, and an office sign on the front door, and we have two doctors' offices, and then we enter into dreams that the patients are having, and those dreams, the sexual presence of those dreams, and then we also, kind of have an explanation of the fantasies, and then we also have hypnosis in the film, with the sex act happening there while somebody is being hypnotized, a bit of a rape per se. Where the person is enjoying it, though, because it is linking to their fantasies. And so what we have here also is we have the idea of hypnosis, and living out your dreams, living out your fantasies using hypnosis, unbeknownst to the patient, however, that they are actually having sex with their doctor. We have a very interesting turn of events in this film as well, as we have the doctor. We're almost seeing the fantasy and seeing the doctor looking like a famous Hollywood star, which he already did at the beginning of the film, kind of, but then all of a sudden he really becomes that famous Hollywood star. So it's almost like this surreal quality where the camera's actually picking up fantasy and the dream itself and interchanging. Now we also have this spectacular scene in Super Sex where we see Carlos Tobalina using effects of somebody entering into somebody else's kind of possessing somebody else and their dream and their fantasy, and then utilizing cutting to go back and forth between the two bodies as they are having sex, because that is the fantasy, to be that person. Oh, I wish I could be that person so I could have sex with their spouse. That type of idea. And the effects that Carlos uses here of kind of the soul of this one person entering the body is really, really awesome. We also have him utilizing kind of a hazy, dreamy quality to the camera as well, in one section of a dream or a fantasy. Interesting themes involving also the soul being satisfied, but not the body. So this dichotomy between the physical body and the spiritual, emotional body, the soul, the mind. Um, and we have sexual dysfunctions like impotence and being cured by um, very against the grain sexual fantasies and fetishes. We even have an African American girl in this film as well, which uh, you don't see a lot of diversity sometimes in these films, which is interesting. And it was a girl that I did not recognize. It was not Desiree from Sex World or. So that was or Love Slaves. So that was pretty wild. I believe she was in Love Slaves, Desiree. Anyway, but she was great. There was also this Asian girl in here as well that I've never seen before. So there was definitely some diversity in this film. Um, I believe Carlos repeated one ejaculation scene, which he's sometimes known to do from a different angle. And we have some pretty, sexy, dirty dialogue in the film, and of course, utilizing this wild masturbation scene with the secretary and two girls, one guy, two guys, one girl, a guy who wants to see his wife have sex with another guy, which is going to cure sexuality, and then we have. Just a lot of elements of repression, sexual repression of sorts in this film, which um, the interesting thing is if you watch the trailer, I believe Carlos Tobalina is narrating the trailer of Super Sex, and he says something like, the only way to cure sexual problems is with sex. And so we truly have sexual counseling going on here. Now there are actual counselors out there who are legal counselors who have sex with their patients. I believe. I believe there have been some movies on that before, and I think I mentioned it in other videos in the past on this page, where they are kind of sexual counselors utilizing sexual practices with their patients, with couples, even married couples, things like that. And Tobalina dealt with that in a movie called Love Champions, I believe it was called, which I've reviewed in this YouTube page with Danielle on the cover. I believe that's the film. So this is Super Sex from 1987. We get some great shots of San Francisco at the beginning of the film because I believe most of, if not all, of Carlos Tobalina's films are in San Francisco, and San Francisco was the safer spot between San Francisco and LA for X-rated cinema, at the time, and it was just a safer spot, I believe, especially in the 70s. This is Super Sex from 1987, 80 minutes. Here it is, folks, from Vinegar Syndrome. Looks beautiful, and it's just wild, hot, and sexy, and especially in the last, 30 minutes of the film, it's just sex scene after sex scene, and we get some funny, hilarious, intricate themes and dialogue and dreams and fantasies and all these different sequences, and a lot of different characters sitting on the counseling couch. But it's really in the last 30 minutes, all of a sudden it's just back to back sex scenes with what's happening between the two counselors who are now working at the office and the former secretary who does not work there any longer. You shall see. Super Sex 1987 by Carlos Tobalina, aka Troy Benny. Thank you so much for watching the Ted Rubizarro YouTube page, where I talk about films that I believe need to be talked about more, like Super Sex. Thank you so much. Please feel free to check out all my other reviews and my own personal films by googling Apartment 1014 Films. Thank you so much, and good night.